Most Christians know Jesus died as a sacrifice. Some know the Passover lamb pointed to him. That is where the teaching usually stops. But almost nobody has been taught that there were not one or two sacrifices in the Old Testament pointing to the cross. There were dozens. Each one was a different angle on the same event, each one loaded with detail that would only make sense centuries later. Here is what changes everything. The 5 major Old Testament sacrificial systems, the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering, were not random religious rituals. They were a 5-part picture of what Jesus would do on a single afternoon. Every element, every requirement, every detail of what was allowed and what was forbidden. All of it points to one event that had not yet happened. But here is what most Christians have never been told. The sacrifices were not just symbols pointing at a future event. They were a blueprint. God was building the mechanics of atonement into Israel's worship life 1,500 years before the cross, with a precision that no human author could have planned. 5 sacrificial systems. 1 day of atonement with 2 goats. 1 bronze serpent. 1 binding of Isaac. That is 8 pictures of the cross, each one showing something the others do not. 8 pictures, 1 event. And by the end of this video, you will never read Leviticus the same way again. Before we go sacrifice by sacrifice, we need to understand what these sacrifices actually were. Most Christians have been handed a version of them that is too thin to carry the weight of what they contain. 3 things need to be settled first. The Hebrew word for sacrifice is korban. It means to draw near. These were not punishment rituals. They were approach protocols. God was laying out the only terms on which a holy God and a sinful people could share the same space. The sacrifices were also not Israel's idea. God designed every detail, the animal, the gender, the condition, how it was killed, what happened to the blood, what was burned, what was eaten, and what was forbidden. Every specification was architectural. Nothing was left to personal taste or tradition. And the sacrifices fall into 2 groups. Some were substitutionary, something died in your place. Others were representational, something stood before God on your behalf. Jesus fulfilled both groups on the same day at the same cross. That is the frame. Now let us go through the blueprint piece by piece. The burnt offering is the sacrifice most people think they already understand. An animal was brought to the altar and burned. That is the version most Christians carry. But that summary leaves out almost everything that matters. The worshiper could bring a bull, a ram, or a bird, depending on what they could afford. God built an economic scale into the offering so that no one was priced out. But whatever the animal, the result was the same. The entire thing was burned. Nothing was kept. Nothing was eaten. No portion went to the priest, no portion went home with the family. Everything went up to God. That is what made this offering different from all the others. What it meant was total surrender. Not partial. Not conditional. Not most of me held back from nothing. The whole animal consumed on the altar was a picture of a person laying everything before God without reservation. Here is what most people miss about the burnt offering. The requirement was not just death. Death was only the beginning of the specification. Leviticus lays out the details in full. The animal had to be a male without blemish. It had to be killed on the north side of the altar, not anywhere the priest felt like standing. The blood had to be thrown against the sides of the altar, not poured, not dripped, thrown. The animal had to be skinned and cut into its parts before a single piece touched the fire. Every step was prescribed. None of it was left to personal preference. This was not a vague gesture toward holiness. This was engineering. God was not saying, bring me something that reminds you of devotion. He was saying, bring me this animal, kill it here, handle the blood this way, cut it like this, and burn all of it. The precision was the point. Now look at the fulfillment. Paul writes in Romans 12 verse 1, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Most people read that verse as a general call to dedication. But Paul is using burnt offering language on purpose. He knows exactly what he is reaching for. A living sacrifice that is holy and acceptable is a burnt offering that qualifies, no blemish, fully given, nothing held back. But the deeper fulfillment is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will but yours be done. That is the burnt offering arriving in human form. No reservation, no condition, everything given, fully consumed by the will of God. The burnt offering was not primarily about death. Animals died in all 5 sacrificial systems. What made the burnt offering distinct was what happened after the death. Everything burned. Nothing remained. Total consecration. And that is what the cross required before anything else. Not just a death, a complete surrender. The burnt offering, and most people skip straight past it. That is a problem, because the grain offering answers one of the most important questions the cross ever raises. There was no animal in this offering, no blood, no death. The worshipper brought flour, oil, and frankincense. A portion of it was burned on the altar. The rest went to the priests. That was it. By the standards of what most people picture when they think of Old Testament sacrifice, this one barely registers. But here is the detail that changes everything. 2 ingredients were strictly forbidden. No leaven, no honey, not reduced, not limited, forbidden entirely. Nothing that ferments, nothing that breaks down over time, nothing that corrupts. And the grain offering was never brought alone. It was always presented alongside the burnt offering. The 2 went together, every time, which means the grain offering was not a separate act of worship. It was the companion to the death. It was the life laid beside the sacrifice. Here is what most people miss about the grain offering. The leaven prohibition is not a food rule. Paul makes that clear in 1 Corinthians 5 when he tells the church to purge out the old leaven, because a little leaven works its way through the whole batch. Leaven in the Bible is corruption. It is the small wrong that spreads until it has touched everything. The grain offering required a life with none of that in it. Pure flour, clean oil, no corruption present, no decay allowed. And the reason that matters is this. For a substitute to work, the substitute has to qualify. You cannot pay someone else's debt with counterfeit money. You cannot take someone's place before a holy God with a life that has its own record of sin. The grain offering was God building that requirement into Israel's worship system 1,500 years before Jesus arrived. The life that accompanied the death had to be without leaven, without corruption, without a single spot that disqualified it. The fulfillment is in Hebrews 4 verse 15. We do not have a high priest who cannot understand our weakness, but one who was tempted in every way that we are, yet did not sin. That verse is the grain offering in human form. Tempted at every point, meaning the pressure was real, the test was genuine, yet without sin. No leaven, no corruption. A life that fully qualified to be laid alongside the death. This is why the cross accomplished what 1,500 years of animal sacrifices could not. Animals were without blemish on the outside. Jesus was without sin on the inside. The grain offering made that distinction before anyone had language to explain it. Without a sinless life, there is no valid death. The grain offering was God saying that, in flour and oil centuries before the cross. Every other sacrifice in the Levitical system ended the same way. The animal was killed, the blood was handled, and something was burned. The worshipper watched. They did not eat. They did not participate in what came after. They brought the offering, the priest did his work, and they went home. The peace offering was different in every way that matters. The Hebrew name for it is shalomim, and it comes from the same root as shalom. Most people translate shalom as peace, but the word carries more than the absence of conflict. It means wholeness, completeness, everything in its right place. And that root word sitting at the center of this offering tells you exactly what it was designed to express. Here is what made it unlike anything else in the system. The offering was shared. A portion was burned on the altar for God. A portion went to the priest. And a significant portion went back to the worshipper and their family to take home and eat. It was the only sacrifice in the entire Levitical system where the worshipper sat down and ate as part of the offering itself. God, priest, and people all receiving from the same sacrifice. All at the same table. What it meant was not just forgiveness. Forgiveness clears a debt. The peace offering was about something beyond that. It was about fellowship, restored relationship, the kind of closeness where you sit down together and share a meal. That is what the peace offering was pointing at. Here is what most people miss about the peace offering. Could not be brought first. There was an order, and it was not optional. The sin offering and the guilt offering had to be dealt with before the peace offering could be placed on the altar. You could not walk into the tabernacle carrying shalom on a debt that had not been settled. The meal only happens after the account has been cleared. Fellowship only follows atonement. That sequence was built into the system by design. The fulfillment lands in two places. The first is the upper room. On the night before the cross, Jesus takes bread and cup and says, "This is my body. This is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." That is a peace offering. It is a shared meal between God and his people, held the night before the atonement that would make the meal permanently possible. Jesus was hosting the peace offering before the sin offering had been completed. He was showing them the destination before walking into the transaction that would get them there. The second fulfillment is still ahead. Revelation 19 ends with a wedding supper, the final gathering, the eternal meal, the peace offering that never ends and never needs to be repeated. The peace offering tells you what God was building toward from the very beginning. Not just a cleared record, not just a courtroom where the charges are dropped. A table, a shared meal, God and his people together with nothing between them. That is what all of this was always for. The sin offering sits at the center of the entire sacrificial system. It is also the one most people misunderstand, because they focus on the wrong part of it. Most people picture the death. An animal killed on the altar, blood handled by the priest, the ceremony completed. But the most important moment in the sin offering did not happen at the altar. It happened before the animal was ever killed. It happened when the worshiper walked up, placed both hands on the head of the animal and pressed down. That gesture was not reverence. It was not a way of saying thank you for this offering. It was transfer. The sin offering was brought specifically for unintentional sin. The things you did wrong without realizing. The ways you fell short without knowing. And the mechanic built into the offering was physical and deliberate. The worshiper laid their hands on the animal's head, and in that moment, the guilt moved from the person to the animal. The animal then carried what the person had brought, and it died in their place. Here is what most people miss about the sin offering. Leviticus 4 is careful to distinguish between different kinds of people bringing it. Priest who sinned brought one animal. A leader brought a different one. A common person brought another. The animals were not the same, but the mechanic was identical in every single case. Hands on the head. Transfer of guilt. Death of a substitute. God was not changing the system based on who showed up. He was making one point over and over to every level of Israelite society. Sin has to go somewhere, and the only place it can go is onto a substitute who dies in your place. This is not a metaphor dressed up in ceremony. This is the mechanics of substitutionary atonement written into a physical act that Israel repeated for 1,500 years. Every worshiper who ever pressed their hands onto the head of a sin offering was performing, with their own body, the transaction that the cross would one day complete. The fulfillment is in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21. For our sake God made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Read that slowly. He was made to be sin, not sinful, not associated with sin, made to be sin. That is the hands pressing down. That is the transfer. Our sin moved to him. His righteousness moved to us. The sin offering is not a symbol of the cross. It is a diagram of it drawn in animal blood, centuries before it happened. Every time an Israelite pressed their hands onto that animal's head, they were acting out in physical motion the precise exchange that would take place on the cross. Here is what every Israelite who ever brought a sacrifice knew. It would have to be brought again. Next week, next month, next year. The sin offering covered sin, but it did not remove it. Hebrews 10 verse 4 says it plainly. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. The entire sacrificial system was a holding pattern, not a solution. It was God saying something is coming that will do what this cannot. We are living on the other side of what they were waiting for. Most people treat the sin offering and the guilt offering as the same thing with a different name. They are not. The difference between them is small enough to miss and important enough to change how you understand grace. The sin offering dealt with moral failure. The guilt offering dealt with something more specific. It was brought when a person had done damage, when they had taken something that did not belong to them, when they had violated something sacred, when they had cheated someone or defrauded them. The guilt offering was not just about the wrong committed. It was about the debt created. And here is what made it different from every other sacrifice in the system. Death alone was not enough. The worshipper had to bring the animal, yes, but they also had to make restitution. Whatever had been taken or damaged had to be paid back in full, plus an additional 20% on top. The sacrifice and the repayment had to happen together. One without the other did not satisfy the offering. God was making a point that atonement is not just pardon. It is payment. Here is what most people miss about the guilt offering. Isaiah 53 verse 10 uses the exact Hebrew word for it. Ashem. When his soul makes an offering for guilt. Not a sin offering. Not a general sacrifice. A guilt offering. Isaiah wrote that centuries before the cross, and he chose that specific word deliberately. The suffering servant in Isaiah 53 was not just carrying sin in a broad, general sense. He was satisfying a specific debt, a precise obligation, a full account with a balance that had to be settled, not just covered over. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Covered and settled are not the same thing. The earlier sacrifices in the system covered sin year after year. They placed something over the debt. But the guilt offering pointed to something different. Pointed to a final settlement. A transaction where the debt itself was dealt with, not just deferred. The fulfillment is in Colossians 2 verse 14. Canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. Paul is not using vague spiritual language here. He is describing a legal document, a written record of what was owed, being permanently canceled. The principal and the 20%, settled in full. Not reduced, not delayed, canceled. This is what grace actually is. Most people picture grace as God deciding not to look too closely at the debt. The guilt offering corrects that picture entirely. Grace is not God looking the other way. Grace is God absorbing the full cost of a debt that was genuinely owed, so that the account could be closed permanently rather than just pushed to a later date. The guilt offering was God building that truth into Israel's worship system long before Paul found the words for it in Colossians. Every sacrifice covered in this video so far, the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering, was brought throughout the year, one worshiper at a time, one debt at a time. But once a year everything stopped. And one day on the calendar stood above all the others. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It happened on the 10th day of the 7th month. And what took place on that day was unlike anything else in Israel's entire worship life. The high priest, not a regular priest, not a Levite assistant, only the high priest, rose before dawn, bathed and dressed in plain white linen. Not the ornate robes he wore on other days. Plain white. And then he did something no other person in Israel was permitted to do. He walked through the veil into the most holy place, into the room where God's presence dwelled, carrying blood. 2 goats had been chosen at the start of the day. The first was sacrificed. Its blood was caught, carried through the outer court, through the holy place, and then behind the veil, into the most holy place itself. The high priest sprinkled it on the mercy seat, the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. The blood went to the place where God's presence rested. Justice was being satisfied at the very throne of God. Then the high priest came back out. He walked to the second goat, the one that was still alive, and he laid both hands on its head. The same gesture from the sin offering, but this time it was not one person's guilt being transferred. It was the sin of the entire nation. Every failure, every unpaid debt, every wrong committed by every person in Israel across the entire year. All of it transferred onto that animal. And then the goat was led out into the wilderness and released. It walked away carrying what had been placed on it. It did not come back. Here is what most people miss about the Day of Atonement. There were two goats because one goat could not carry both truths at the same time. The first truth was that sin demands death. Justice required blood, and blood had to go to the mercy seat. The second truth was that sin had to be removed, not just covered. It had to go somewhere far away and not return. God split the picture across two animals because no single animal was large enough to hold everything atonement actually requires. The fulfillment is laid out in Hebrews 9 and 10. Jesus is the sacrificed goat. His blood carried not into a tent built by human hands but into the true sanctuary in heaven. And he is the scapegoat. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our sins from us. Both goats fulfilled in one person on one afternoon at one cross. The Day of Atonement was the most detailed ceremony in Israel's entire calendar because what it was pointing toward was the most costly transaction in the history of the universe. Everything covered so far has come from the Levitical system. The 5 offerings, the Day of Atonement, all of it was built into the formal worship structure God gave Israel at Sinai. But God did not confine his previews of the cross to the book of Leviticus. He embedded them into stories, into moments that happened before the sacrificial system even existed, and into events that took place in the wilderness long after it was established. 2 of those moments stand above the rest. The first is in Numbers 21. Israel is in the wilderness and they are dying. Poisonous serpents have moved through the camp and the bites are fatal. People are dropping. Moses cries out to God, and God gives him an instruction that makes no immediate sense. Make a bronze serpent. Lift it up on a pole in the middle of the camp. Tell the people that anyone who has been bitten only needs to look at it and they will live. Moses does it, and everyone who looked at the bronze serpent was healed. Centuries later, Jesus is in a conversation with a religious leader named Nicodemus, and he reaches back to that story himself. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Jesus made the connection. He did not leave it to interpretation. The second moment is earlier still. Genesis 22. God tells Abraham to take his son Isaac, the son of the promise, the one everything depended on, to Mount Moriah and sacrifice him there. Abraham obeys. He binds Isaac, places him on the altar, and raises the knife. And at that moment God stops him. A ram is caught in a thicket nearby. The ram dies in Isaac's place. Here is what most people miss about both of these. The bronze serpent was not just a symbol of healing. It was made in the form of the very thing that was killing people. A serpent lifted up, so that those dying from a serpent's bite could look at it and live. Paul writes in Romans 8 verse 3 that God sent his Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, in the form of the thing that was killing humanity, lifted up, and everyone who looked to him was saved. The shape of the cure matched the shape of the disease. God built that picture into a wilderness story long before the cross existed. And on Mount Moriah, when Isaac asked his father where the lamb was, Abraham said something that carries more weight than it first appears. God will provide for himself the lamb. Not God will find a lamb somewhere. The Hebrew allows a second reading, God will provide himself as the lamb. Both readings are true, and both landed on the same hill centuries later, when the one Abraham's words were pointing to was lifted up outside Jerusalem. The cross was not a last-minute solution to a problem that got out of hand. It was the destination. Every story, every ceremony, every animal, every drop of blood in the Old Testament was moving toward it from the very beginning. Step back from all of it for a moment and look at what has been laid out across this video. 8 pictures. 5 sacrificial systems built into the formal worship life of Israel. 1 day of atonement that held the entire system together once a year. 2 moments embedded outside the system entirely. 1 in a narrative that predates Sinai, 1 in a wilderness camp, both pointing at the same event. Each one showed something the others did not. The burnt offering showed that the cross required total surrender before anything else. Not just a death. A complete giving over, nothing held back, everything consumed. The grain offering showed that only a sinless life could make the death valid. Without leaven, without corruption, a life that fully qualified to be laid alongside the sacrifice. The peace offering showed that forgiveness was never the final destination. The destination was a table, a shared meal, a restored relationship where God and his people eat together with nothing between them. The sin offering showed the exact mechanics of what happened at the cross. Hands pressed down, guilt transferred, righteousness returned. A diagram drawn in physical motion, repeated for 1,500 years. The guilt offering showed that grace is not God overlooking a debt. It is God absorbing the full cost of one, so that the account could be permanently closed. The Day of Atonement showed that it took 2 goats to picture what one cross would accomplish, because what atonement actually costs is too large for a single image to contain. The bronze serpent showed that the cure would take the form of the disease, lifted up in the likeness of the very thing that was killing people. And the binding of Isaac showed that God himself would provide the lamb, and that he would be the lamb. None of these were approximate. None of them were loose, general gestures in the direction of something spiritual. The animal had to be without blemish. The blood had to go on a specific piece of furniture behind a specific veil. The worshipper had to lay their own hands on the specific head of the specific animal. The high priest had to enter on a specific day wearing specific clothes carrying specific blood. God was not sketching ideas. He was engineering a structure detail by detail across centuries. And here is what that precision means. If every requirement, every prohibition, and every specification in the sacrificial system landed exactly where it was pointing, and it did, then the one sacrifice that fulfilled all of them is not one possible reading of those texts. It is the only destination they were ever moving toward. You are not reading Leviticus for historical facts about ancient religious practices. You are reading the architectural drawings of the cross, produced 1,500 years before the cross existed. 8 pictures. 1 event. 1 God who was never improvising. If this video changed how you see the Old Testament, if Leviticus will never feel like dry religious rules again, share it with someone who skips the Old Testament because they think it has nothing to say to them. It has everything to say to them. It always did. It is the blueprint. Subscribe and we will keep reading it together. Every scripture has a story. Every story has a lesson. Thank you for watching this one with me. If it spoke to you, like this video, share it with someone, and subscribe to Scripture Before History. And let us keep uncovering the truth that time tried to bury, so you never miss what history has been hiding in plain sight.